Hi, everyone. It's Ian Heller with Distribution Strategy Group here today with Warren Knapp, Customer Success Director at SPS Commerce. Warren, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to talk about how SPS Commerce helps distributors.
Thanks for having me and really looking forward to the dialogue today.
Yeah, it should be fun. We've got several things that I wanted to talk about. One are some trends in distribution, and some of these have more nuance, I think, than people think. So there's a lot of consolidation, for example, going on, but that tends to be at the top of the bigger companies, and then there are a whole bunch of startups happening too. But nonetheless, it does have an impact on industry competition. Do you guys pay attention to consolidation that's happening in distribution, and how do you think about the business opportunities and challenges it brings?
So I think we look at it in a couple of different ways. One is for many of our current SPS customers, they're in that acquisition or consolidation mode. We'd like to think that they're all the ones acquiring, right? Because then your
Sure.
business is preserved and you do great. But there's also cases where it's not the case. What we're really laser focused in on is what does that mean for the solutions that we deliver, and how do we think about continuity as they go through the process? So if you think about it, in many cases, we're supporting significant supplier communities. And when these acquisitions come through, those supplier communities are stuck in a little bit of the, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. And I'm sure you're shocked by this, but these organizations aren't necessarily very good at communicating what their expectations are. And so you get a lot of cases where, a supplier will be reaching out to us saying, hey, do you have any idea what's going on with this? I don't know where my orders are going to come from. So things like that, where we really have to look at how do we help support them. We were talking about this a little bit before, but you had mentioned a little bit about what's the value of consolidation? Like in some cases, huge, tremendous value. Combined organizations, they're going to go, storm the beaches and do all this stuff. And so often it just doesn't end up being the case. And, we see that in cases of organizations that really begin to struggle at some point under the weight of multiple systems and multiple integrations. And that path of figuring out, okay, where do I start? Do I combine item masters first? What do I do about location codes that are all over the board? Like, how do I think about combining this? We've even worked with a couple where we got into these really interesting dialogues of how do your suppliers know you? Like, do they know you by the corporate name, or do they know you by some subset of, prior acquisition names? And the last point I'd make on that one that I find fascinating is then it also gets into a point of if you're thinking about trying to onboard a group of suppliers, they don't know what your entity is. And then they might do business with multiple entities, and now they're continuing to have to do it in multiple different ways. So we see the consolidation show up in some really interesting areas. The nice part is, for the most part, we can help, but it certainly is a challenge of figuring out what the right path there is.
And by help, you don't just provide technology, do you?
No, we really don't. It's one of the things that's, I think, phenomenal about SPS is when we talk with big distributors or other buying organizations about how we can help them. A lot of what we talk about is taking technology out of the equation and saying, look, as an organization, there's certain integrations, transactions that you need in order to do business. The value in partnering with us is we can engage your suppliers to understand how they can get there, and we can offer them solutions ultimately to be successful. In many cases, we spend a lot of time with our own internal folks saying, hey, look, when you're talking with these large distributors, do not use things like an EDI 850 or anything like that. Talk about their order cycle and seek to understand things like how do their buyers interact, and do they interact differently based on the types of suppliers? Because if we understand that, then we're better able to partner with those suppliers. We can understand the business better, and we can actually prescribe solutions that are much better and make it easier for all parties in the long run, because nobody wants to be unique. That's what we run into all the time from customers, is saying, hey, can you help me understand what are others doing about this? And In a lot of cases, it becomes, what is my competition doing? Which always leads to that slightly awkward moment of, I hate to tell you, they're actually doing it a lot better. And
Yeah.
you should maybe think about doing it this way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, the fact that you have visibility into so many different companies and how they manage their supplier relationships, their product data, their ordering,
Yeah.
et cetera, that's a tremendous amount of value that you bring beyond just providing technology.
Yeah. And as we've done so much of this over time, we've also hit a point where we can better tell people where the snags are going to be. So
Hmm.
we can really talk about like, okay, as we're going through this journey with you and you're looking to automate, here's where your business is going to struggle. If you think about you're taking a supplier live, what's going to be the challenge in getting them to do that? And then provide prescriptive solutions to it. Here's how to think about the communication. Here's how to think about measuring, asking questions of things like how are you going to measure supplier success internally? How do you measure how effective your purchasing is? There's a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily see, but if we understand more about what that buying organization is doing, we can then help to advise on, well, here's how you can think about enabling more data to make that process more effective.
Got it. Okay. And it feels like the necessity to be competitive in how you manage your suppliers and your product information, et cetera. And it's become a lot more urgent because the standard is changing, right? So you've got outside players like Amazon, who's now created Amazon Business. Walmart's got Walmart for Business. QXO is aggressively trying to acquire distributors. Home Depot actually sells more to businesses than consumers now. They're more of a distributor than a retailer. And they bring with them new levels of expertise and technology than most of the distributors they compete with. So I mean, the competition is getting tougher. Distributors need to do this stuff better because of that those people moving in, right?
Absolutely. And I would actually even mention, I, I don't know if it was, I don't want to be catty, but I think it was an EVP of supply chain a number of years ago at a distributor they're working with who fundamentally said Amazon's never going to be a threat to us because they can't provide that personal level of service and all the rest. And I remember thinking at the time, I find that suspect. And I think that plays out because you brought up Amazon Business. We talk about this with the team here at SPS that is focused on industrial supply. And if you look at Amazon Business, MRO is one of the categories. It's like that's a key thing for many customers is figuring that out. The other story I would share is think about how we buy these days, right? With how prevalent Google is. I mean, if I needed a tire pressure gauge for my car, and I had one from Amazon the next day. Like, I always think about that, like in an industrial setting. Okay, I need a part for the line. I can try to figure out where it is, or I can probably get it next day with Amazon. Like, my gosh, what an impact that is. Like, as a distributor, there's so much value in your local locations being able to help people, especially in that industrial space. So how are you expanding what you're doing so that you get around that and that you are that first mouse click or you are that first call? Like that's a massive challenge.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to a retailer now online or a distributor and you see, ships within 48 hours, you're like, what are you doing? I mean, that's not
Yeah,
acceptable anymore.
yeah. When I first came to SPS, one of the first retail side programs I was involved with was one which was enabling the inventory advice for a local retailer. And at that time, so this is more years ago than I care to admit, one of the big value props was they were talking about, well, no, we actually know that if somebody places an order with us and if they haven't gotten a confirmation of that order and when it's going to ship within 48 hours, we're going to get a phone call. Now, if I don't see confirmation of shipment within 24 hours,
Yeah,
I'm thinking about, did they get the order? Is this legit? Like
right.
the rules are changing.
Yeah, they are. And of course, AI is going to bring even new levels of both expectation and performance. How are you incorporating AI into what you do and helping distributors incorporate it as well?
So a number of different ways. We're doing a lot of work with AI to analyze data in our network to help inform the recommendations that we make. So understanding, little things, if you think about like as a buying organization, there's certain data points that I have to place an order, in order for all of it to flow. As a supplier, I need it as easy as possible. Like honestly, if I'm a supplier, I probably want the bare minimum of information just to make it easier for me. And so we're looking at using AI to help more prescribe how can we be sharper in our recommendations. We also see it turning up a lot when you think about just internally things like our customer treatment strategy. And how do we use AI to better inform and look at trends that we can then share back with organizations based on our network data?
Okay, good. And I assume that with all the supply chain challenges that have, you know, just emerged like black swan events over the last couple of years, that distributors who've been using your products were in a better position than those who weren't. I mean, we've had, the attacks in the in the Middle East, and we've had um, the Panama Canal dried up, and all these chip shortages, and I mean, it's been nuts. How were you able to help people during those times?
I think probably in a number of different ways. One is that there's a little bit of the I told you so in it, in that there were, before a lot of this happened, even pre-COVID, a lot of times we would get in discussions with customers who would look at it and say, I don't know if really getting inventory data is going to drive that much for my business. And you look at it now and it's so obvious, like it's table stakes. I've got to know how I can source product. So I think there's that. The other, I think, is really just a recognition of the more that you can automate so that all you're doing is managing exceptions. And that I can't spend time on what I know is working effectively. I got to spend time on where I can drive incremental revenue. And how do I think about my customer expectations and how, similar to how we were talking earlier about like the ease of going someplace else. If you're managing everything manually and you're trying to track a customer order, the odds that you're going to miss a few things is so much higher than if you have some level of data and automation that allow you to get ahead of it. And I think so much of what we do is focused on, especially in the last several years, recognizing that at one point, maybe, if you had 80% of your volume electronic, you were good. And it's really becoming that you got to have 98%, you've got to have 100, because without it, you're just flying blind. And the one that's going to end up suffering is your customer ultimately.
Yeah, so for distributors who feel the need to achieve that 98% automation
Yeah.
around standardized tasks, and there are a lot of different choices out there, but how do you get those advantages to solve the problems that we're talking about without relying on unproven technologies?
So much of that, in my mind, to one degree, is starting with kind of understanding where they are from a technology perspective before we get into it, into solutions. And a lot of our solution set is really adaptable. So things that come to mind for me is we all see value in things like a purchase order acknowledgement, understanding what a supplier's intent to fill is. There are organizations that we work with that don't have the capability to process that data, but we have tools to allow them to utilize it. So I think it begins with a recognition of where are you from a technology standpoint, and then focus on on a solution that will get them value. The other one is getting really, really tight on the supplier segmentation and really clear on who are the suppliers that are driving the most volume. So those become the ones where it's non-negotiable. You've got to have that in place. And then getting creative with more of the smaller ones to understand what does optimization look like for them. And we're talking about a technology set stack at our organization that's really well proven, and it's constantly evolving. So again, going back to what I said a little bit earlier, in many ways, we try to take that approach of, hey, we're taking technology off the table. What are your capabilities? We will figure out how that merges with everything that we do, and then we'll provide a solution to the supplier if they need it, but again, to meet them where they are to be most impactful.
Got it. Okay. And all of this relies on successful integration, and you're the
Yes.
customer success director. So this is an area
Yeah.
of specialty for you, I would imagine. So,
Yeah.
I mean, what's your advice to distributors on how you achieve successful integration of a substantial new technology? What does it look like? How do you do it?
You got to start with what's the business problem that you're trying to solve. And you've really got to be willing to open the hood and look at what are your current business processes and what do you have in terms of inconsistency. The one that comes to mind for me a lot is we've worked with customers where we had actually had to ask a question to say, at what point is a PO actually a PO? And we got multiple different answers. And
Wow.
so some of it is you've really got to recognize up front, you've got to have your house and your process in order to begin with. And then once you have that sorted out, so much to me around the integration is around focus. And it's about being very deliberate about looking at it so crisply through that lens of here's how we can achieve value. Let's not get too far out into the outliers. Let's understand if we have unique sets of suppliers and unique sets of requirements, let's treat them that way. But there's so much upfront work that you can do that then when you get into the meat of integration, in my mind, a lot of it there is the term that gets thrown around a lot is like, well, we have system integration testing and then we have user acceptance testing. And I was a consultant before, so I speak those terms, but I also don't like them a whole heck of a lot because I honestly think the better term you really have to think about in that phase is how is the business validating what's working? Like it's not just that a user is going in there and accepting it, but is a business user able to go in, work with the data, and actually look at to the degree of saying, okay, I know how this is going to impact my day-to-day job, and I know what I'm going to do. And then even further downstream, really thinking about, okay, what are the metrics? How are we reporting on that? How are we using data to drive discussions with our suppliers about how we improve? Because I think everybody wants to get better at it, but in God we trust, all others need data. How are you going to measure that? And then how are you going to present it back? So I really think if you think about focus, that preparation up front, and then what are the measurables at the end that you use, those are really the keys to teeing it up for success. And none of that has anything to do with the XML tag for a PO number or how you're sending a vendor ID in an REFIA segment, right? It's if you have those foundations, the rest flows so much better.
Okay, so speaking of measurement, since you brought it
Yeah.
up, uh, how does SPS Commerce ensure a seamless transition, successful implementation, and measurable ROI for distributors?
We really start with looking at the very beginning of a program, understanding what's the vendor community that needs to be onboarded. And that's getting into a level of specificity and understanding, okay, who are the top suppliers that have to be a part of this? What does the rest of the community look like? And then being very tailored in the communication out to them and providing direct information and KPIs as to the progress back to that distributor along the way. So, for example, our expectation is that 4 weeks after a program launches, that's when people are to commit and being really crisp on we're 4 weeks in, we're tracking towards 70% commitment. Here are the steps that we think you should take to try to drive that commitment. So we start with that. We then move into visibility when it comes to the supplier experience moving through implementation. Because it's one thing for a supplier to say, yeah, I want to do it. It's another for a supplier to actually be ready. And so again, tracking and understanding how are people moving through the process. When we think about go live, or you think about that production piece, it's so much about training for the business and the users to understand what to do. And then it's about that continual touch base on, are you seeing the intended results? So for example, 30 days in, okay, you've actually exchanged orders electronically. Let's just say it's an order program with 50% of the suppliers that were run through. Okay, now let's go look at the data. If you look at the acknowledgments, how many exceptions did you see? Well, we saw 25% item rejections. Okay, we have an item number problem we got to go solve. Because what's happening here is your suppliers are getting orders and they don't know what these items are. So let's figure out how we adapt to that next. And then the other one, and I'm sure this will resonate with you, is ultimately the big metric is on time and full, right? Like did I get what I wanted? Did I get it on time? And I think for a lot of groups, once you get to that, you can then begin branching into a lot of other metrics. But that one always feels like the holy grail to me when you start looking at suppliers of how are they doing with OTIF?
Oh yeah, I agree, and I like your approach. When you talked about looking for, how many items were rejected. You're almost doing this Pareto approach where you're identifying what the biggest barriers to getting the all the benefits of adoption are, and then tackling them in order. It sounds like.
And it's also a lot in there's so many things that seemingly come out of the woodwork, and we really try to move more of that upstream. So when I go back to that concept of kind of like the business validation, a lot of that is trying to get really crisp there on understanding, okay, so what is the nature of your item master? Or, do you think anything about this is going to change? One that always cracks me up that runs around is, well, their PO number structure changed, which their PO, like, how can that possibly be a barrier to doing business? Well, it went from, 3 digits and then a dash and something else to 10 to what, but it's an issue. And I think
Yeah.
the more that you find that stuff up front, you can then think about how does that get embedded into the process such that if it does pop up when you go live, everybody's prepared. And what's not happening is widespread panic.
Got it. Okay, very interesting. Okay, Warren, let's have some fun and talk about the big picture to wrap up our conversation. If you had to tell distributors about one big change that is likely to happen over the next 5 years that they need to prepare for, what would it be?
One big change over the next. I'm going to have a hard time picking one.
Oh,
I'll be
okay.
honest with you.
By all means, go ahead and pick more.
I think the one that I think about a lot is what's the next big disruption? You mentioned it earlier, right? Like we had COVID and that was one. Then we have political instability, we have war, we have some, what is the next one? And really within that, how are you thinking about preparing for it? Because there's certain things you can absolutely prepare for, but some of them can get really expensive. Like, and I think you see some of that right now with fear going on around potential tariffs around, oh, we got to buy a bunch of inventory. Well, yeah, but what happens when it doesn't go through and you're stuck with all of this is where my head goes. So I think it's a lot of that. How are you thinking about preparing for stuff that we've never seen before? um, as we think about it. The other one, I don't know that it's so much a problem per se, but I think there's an element of how are you thinking about focus in your business and especially your supply chain? Like it's so important to be able to be agile and to be able to identify a potential challenge and then pivot to it quickly. The one that stands out for me with a lot of customers that we work with is real challenges with item data. Well, it's not a small problem to solve, but it is a problem that I think if you focus on it in the right way, is something you can get to resolution fairly quickly, but you have to be willing to really dedicate that time and focus to it.
Got it. Okay. And so here's my next big picture question. Um, we've established earlier in the conversation that for competitive reasons and because there are new forms of AI enabled technology coming online, it's more important than ever for distributors to adopt these new technologies to stay competitive. But how can distributors balance adopting new technologies while also maintaining operational resilience?
I think you really have to be careful about the bright, shiny objects, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? Like the AI can do a ton, but I think being really deliberate about, but what exactly is it going to do for us? I go back to thoughts around from my consulting experience in the past where you'd get demands for reports and you'd look at it and go, okay, but what are you doing with this? Like, it's great that you've got a report that shows you, but what action is it driving? And in my mind, when it comes to a lot of the technology piece, it's really that question of what action is it driving? And if you're looking at, say, like WMS, I think can be a big thing. And we're starting to hear some things around like 2D labels. And I think, yeah, there's value in all of those technologies or improving them, but how exactly is it going to benefit you? And if you can show that, okay, by improving my WMS and by adding shipment data, I actually think I can move stuff through my DC 25% faster, okay, great. Like then you've really got something. But if it's flaky, we sometimes joke that we'll talk with customers and we'll say, well, what do you see as a key business outcome? And they'll say things like enhanced automation. And we kind of go, oh, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Like, what does that, what does that mean?
That's
And
like more profits.
exactly. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, sounds great. Well, how do you know when you're done?
Right.
That type of thing. So I think a lot of it is just getting really crisp on cutting through to what's the value it's going to drive, and then like we had talked about too, how are you going to measure it? Because if you don't have a metric to go back to, it's really, really difficult. And that in my view, when it comes to a lot of the integration stuff, that's where you get a lot of the unnecessary scope creep, is that you start getting into all this other stuff. And then by the time you actually get to the point of rolling it out into production, you're really confused as to what your objective was.
Fantastic. Warren, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners did too.
Ian, thank you. It was such a pleasure. I appreciate it.